The hallway went silent the moment he appeared. Nurses lowered their eyes. Doctors suddenly found reasons to look at their clipboards. Even the maintenance staff moved faster, quieter, as if trying to disappear into the walls. Raymond Holt, CEO of St. Aldan Hospital, walked through the building like a storm front, and everyone had learned to get out of his way. Everyone except the new nurse. Her name was Emma Hayes, 29 years old, soft-spoken, with steady hands and a calm that people sometimes mistook for timidity. She had transferred to St. Aldan 3 weeks earlier, and the staff had already quietly written her off. Too gentle, they whispered. Too patient. She wouldn't last a month here. They didn't know who she was. They didn't know what she had survived. Emma had noticed the fear on her very first day. It wasn't obvious at first. It rarely is in places where fear has been allowed to grow slowly, over years, until it becomes the air itself. But she had been trained to read environments, to notice what others missed. And what she saw at St. Aldan was unmistakable. A young nurse's hands trembling when she heard footsteps in the corridor. A senior doctor changing his medical opinion mid-sentence the moment Holt walked into the room. A colleague sitting alone in a supply closet during lunch, crying silently, afraid to be seen. One afternoon, Emma was restocking medication shelves when she overheard 2 nurses talking nearby. They hadn't noticed her. "He threw a stack of patient files at me yesterday," one of them said, her voice barely above a whisper, because the discharge summaries weren't formatted the way he wanted. "What did you do?" "What could I do?" "He's untouchable. The board loves him because he keeps costs down." Emma said nothing. She just listened, and she remembered. She had encountered men like Raymond Holt before, not in hospitals, but in the field. Leaders who confuse fear with respect. Men who used power as a weapon rather than a responsibility. In the Marines, such men were dealt with swiftly. In civilian institutions, they could reign for decades, leaving broken people in their wake. She had left the military looking for peace. She was beginning to understand that some battles follow you no matter where you go. The morning it all changed began like any other. Emma was in the main lobby when the emergency came in. A man in full cardiac arrest wheeled through the doors by a panicked family. The emergency room was already overwhelmed. The on-duty doctors were managing multiple simultaneous crises. There was no one available. Emma moved without hesitation. She was checking the patient's pulse, issuing calm instructions to the nearest staff members, when Holt appeared at the edge of the lobby. He took in the scene, a nurse he barely recognized, acting without authorization, in his hospital, and his face darkened immediately. "Who gave you permission to touch him?" Emma didn't look up. "If we don't shock him in the next 10 seconds, he won't make it." Holt stepped forward and reached for the equipment in her hands. "You do not give orders in this building." Emma ignored him completely. She placed the defibrillator pads, looked at the team around her, and said clearly, "Everyone stand clear." One clean shock. The patient's body jolted. Then slowly, a heartbeat returned on the monitor. The lobby went absolutely still. Nurses who had watched the whole thing with their hands over their mouths stood frozen. A doctor standing near the reception desk exhaled like a man who had been holding his breath for years. Holt's face had gone from dark red to something beyond color entirely. He pointed at Emma, his hand shaking. "You're finished. I'm terminating your employment today." Emma stood up slowly. She smoothed her scrubs. She looked at Raymond Holt directly, something almost no one at St. Aldan ever did, and said, in a voice quiet enough that only those closest could hear, "Your protocols nearly killed him." Holt convened a meeting the following morning. He called it a disciplinary hearing. He scheduled it in the main hall, in front of the entire staff, because he had done this before, used public humiliation as a tool, made examples of people who stepped out of line, reminded everyone exactly who was in charge. He stood on the small platform at the front of the room and looked out at the assembled faces. Nurses, doctors, administrative staff. All of them silent, all of them waiting, all of them carrying years of quiet endurance in their posture. Emma stood in the crowd, hands clasped behind her back, still, composed. Holt stepped down from the platform and walked toward her slowly. He raised his hand. He had done this before. Slapped nurses in front of colleagues, grabbed doctors by their coats. No one had ever stopped him. No one had ever dared. What happened next took 1.8 seconds. Emma's hand moved. Holt's wrist was locked, his arm twisted precisely and efficiently, and before anyone in that room had processed what they were watching, the CEO of St. Aldan Hospital was on his knees on the floor. The silence was absolute. Then a doctor near the back said, barely audible, "That's a standard Marine Corps restraint technique." Holt looked up from the floor, his face contorted with shock and rage. Who are you?" Emma reached into her scrub pocket. She produced an identification card and held it up calmly. "United States Marine Corps. Combat medic. Staff Sergeant Emma Hayes." The hall erupted. Not in chaos, in something more like a dam breaking. 8 years, 10 years, 15 years of accumulated silence, fear, and suppressed anger pouring through a crack that had suddenly become a flood. A lab technician described being shoved into a wall over a mislabeled specimen. A junior doctor detailed years of unpaid overtime and systematic wage theft. A nurse who had been threatened, belittled, and psychologically broken stood up with shaking hands and a steady voice and said, "Enough." A senior surgeon named Dr. Patricia Chen, who had worked at St. Alden for 18 years and who had gripped the second-floor railing so tightly her knuckles had gone white the day before, stepped forward through the crowd. "I've watched this man destroy good people," she said. Nurses who left medicine entirely. Colleagues who developed serious health problems from the stress. I stayed silent because I was afraid. I'm not afraid anymore. The board of directors standing at the back of the hall exchanged pale glances. What they had dismissed as difficult management style had just revealed itself, publicly and undeniably, as something criminal. Holt was escorted from the building by security that same morning. The weeks that followed were not simple. They were not a fairy tale with a clean ending. Real change never is. Emma was asked by the board to help coordinate the hospital's internal reform. She agreed, on one condition: the staff would lead the changes themselves. Her role was to create the conditions, not to hand down solutions from above. She started small and concrete. An anonymous reporting system was installed that bypassed department heads entirely, routed directly to an independent ethics committee with real authority. Mandatory workplace respect training was scheduled for every member of staff, from surgeons to custodians. Security cameras were installed in all common areas. But she also did something the staff hadn't expected. Every morning, she walked the hospital floors. She learned everyone's name, not just the doctors, but the receptionists, the maintenance workers, the kitchen staff. She asked how they were doing, and she actually stopped to listen to the answer. At first, people were cautious. They had been given false promises before. They had seen initiatives announced and abandoned, policies posted and ignored. They waited for the familiar pattern to reassert itself. It didn't. Day after day, week after week, Emma showed up. Not as an authority figure, as a person, someone who had seen what fear does to human beings and had chosen, with full awareness of the cost, to fight it. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, things changed. Nurses made eye contact in the hallways. A resident asked a clarifying question without checking first to make sure no one important was watching. A doctor and a nurse had a disagreement about a patient's care plan and resolved it calmly, professionally, without anyone raising their voice. Dr. Patricia Chen came to Emma's office one afternoon and sat down quietly. "I've been in medicine for 25 years, she said. I had forgotten what it felt like to actually want to come to work. Emma smiled. "You did the hard part. You spoke up when it mattered. You gave us the opening," Patricia said. "But I want you to know something. People look up to you now. That's a weight. Don't carry it alone." Emma thought about that for a moment. "In the Marines," she said, "we had a saying. No one fights alone. I'm learning that applies here too." Raymond Holt was criminally prosecuted. His management licenses were permanently revoked. An investigative journalist who had been quietly gathering testimony for months published a full account of his conduct, and 3 other hospitals where he had previously worked came forward with their own documentation. The pattern was overwhelming and undeniable. His career ended, completely and irreversibly. Emma was offered a permanent position overseeing medical safety and operations at St. Alden. She accepted, but within 6 months, she had stepped back from administration and returned to direct patient care, which was what she had come here to do in the first place. The reforms she had put in place had taken root. They no longer needed her to hold them up. On the wall of the main lobby, a small glass case was installed. Inside it was Emma's Marine Corps Combat Medic badge. Below it, a simple inscription: "The one who ended the era of fear." One evening, 6 months after Holt's removal, Emma received a phone call from an unknown number. "Is this Emma Hayes?" A woman's voice, careful and tired. "Yes." "My name is Sarah Chen. I'm a nurse at Metropolitan Hospital. I heard about what happened at St. Alden." A pause. "Our director? He's exactly the same. Maybe worse. People are suffering, and I don't know what to do." Emma closed her eyes. She had hoped quietly that St. Alden would be the end of it. One battle, one victory, one chapter closed. But she understood now that the war was larger than one hospital, larger than one tyrant in one city. It was everywhere, in every institution where fear had been allowed to calcify into culture, where cruelty had been excused as leadership, where good people had learned to shrink themselves to survive. "Tell me everything," she said. 3 months later, Emma stood on a stage at a national healthcare conference. The auditorium was full: nurses, doctors, administrators, medical students, all watching her in silence. She looked out at those faces, saw the exhaustion in some of them, the cautious hope in others, the particular expression of people who are waiting to find out whether they can trust what they're hearing. 8 years ago, she began, I was a combat medic in the United States Marine Corps. I've treated gunshot wounds in desert heat. I've performed emergency procedures in moving helicopters. I've held the hands of people in the last moments of their lives." She paused. "The hardest battle I've ever fought was in a hospital corridor, against a man in a suit, with no weapon except the decision to not look away. The room was completely still. Some of you are living in fear right now. Some of you have been silenced, threatened, made to feel small. You think you're alone? You're not. She looked slowly across the auditorium. There are people in this room who understand exactly what you're going through. And the only thing that has ever changed situations like yours, the only thing that has ever worked, is one person deciding to stand up. And then another, until standing up stops being the exception and becomes simply what people do. She held up her Marine ID badge. This reminds me where I came from. But it doesn't define me. What defines all of us is what we choose to do when someone vulnerable needs protecting. She set the badge down on the podium. We didn't become healthcare workers to stay silent. We became healthcare workers to heal, and sometimes, healing means fighting for the people who can't fight for themselves. The applause began slowly, then it built. Then the entire room was on its feet. Emma stood at the podium and let it wash over her. Not with pride exactly, but with something quieter and more durable than pride. She thought about the young nurse crying in the supply closet, the elderly woman who said she had died a little inside every day for years, the doctor who had stood up with shaking hands and said enough. She thought about Sarah Chen, who had called from a dark place and found her way through. She thought about the Marine Corps values she had carried with her across years and continents and the distance between war and healing. Never leave a fallen comrade behind. She had always assumed that meant soldiers. She understood now it meant everyone.